you again. And our conversations, I think, have been progressing along the lines of getting a better understanding of African history, even from prehistorical days, shall we say, coming up to the present. I think that history basically has to be taught, and for history to be taught, you need an educational process. And I think that's one of the problems that we have. We don't have educational processes that teach our history. Because if you look at all of our countries, African countries or Afro-Caribbean countries where we're in the majority, and we've become independent since the 60s, Ghana 57, everybody else 60s and so on coming up. Nobody's really changed the curriculum in terms of the totality of the curriculum that was left by the colonial, I hate to call them masters, but the colonial people, or the colonizers. I know that's true in the Caribbean, and it is true also in Africa. I mean, we're just struggling, shall we say, to have Marcus Garvey taught in the schools in Jamaica. And Kwame Nkrumah is not being taught in the schools in Ghana. And he was the first, a president of Ghana. So we have a curriculum problem, we have an educational problem. And why don't you jump in there? Historically, we have to change that. We have to get the appropriate history on the curriculum. You've written one book and you're in the process of others. How are we going to get that in the curriculum and really, make it part of our mindset? Because the thing is that we have to change our minds. My dad said, I have an original African mind. I don't think many people can say that. Back in the day in the United States, certainly Harlem Renaissance, with the UNIA, they were talking about the new Negro, meaning that now there was a new Negro after the enslavement of the old Negro, shall we say. But now the Negro was becoming awake and conscious of himself, conscious of his history. I think Kwame Nkrumah tried to do something like that in terms of Ghana. What was the new African, the new African? But that has not continued anywhere that I know of in terms of really focusing on changing the mindset. Tell me what your thoughts on that, from the perspective of a historian, and how the educational process can use history to help to change the mindset.
This is what I think. I'm a Black Studies teacher, and I have a saying: Black history is interesting, Black Studies is transformative.
Mm.
And let me explain what I mean by that. During my day jobs, I have been a classroom teacher, and I remember seeing a poster on a school mathematics classroom that referenced Pythagoras in the founding of the Pythagorean theorem. And on a different mathematics classroom, I saw a poster that explained the Roman numerical systems of I, IV, etc., etc. And what these examples show is that when you are dealing with mathematics, you are dealing with the history of mathematics. You see, what these teachers were indirectly teaching their pupils is that the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans were very clever people. And if you were to go through the study of chemistry, it will be the same thing. You're going to get a history of chemistry. English literature is really the history of English literature. And it doesn't matter what the subject is.
Mm-hmm.
Each subject is going to start with the ancient Greeks and Romans. Then we're going to get into the contributions of the European medieval and Renaissance periods. Then we're going to get into the 18th century Enlightenment era. Then we're going to get into the modern period. And this is the case with probably every subject taught in the education institutions, with no exceptions as far as I'm aware. So even if we're dealing with physical education or PE, there's going to be track, there's going to be athletics, ancient Greek culture. There's going to be things like wrestling. Wrestling as we have it today is Greco-Roman culture, etc., etc., etc. It's going to take us on this same tour of European culture. Now, what Black Studies does is it recognizes then that it's not just history that needs to change. We need to change the teaching of every single subject. And the scholars that went the furthest back in the day were people like Professor Ivan van Sertima and the people that were associated with the Portland Model Baseline essays. I don't know, sir, were you aware of these essays?
No, say that again. The name?
The Portland Model Baseline essays. What happened is, in one of the American states, there was a concerted effort to democratize the curriculum and not just democratize the teaching of history, democratize the teaching of mathematics, democratize the teaching of science, democratize the teaching of music, democratize the teaching of art. And they commissioned scholars to write essays. And then, for example, Professor John Henrik Clarke was the person that was commissioned to write the social science essay, and then he based it on history. You had Hunter Haviland Adams was commissioned to write the science essay. You had Beatrice Lumpkin, I think it was, who was commissioned to write the mathematics essay. And what this meant was school teachers in Portland, Oregon, had access to material that reflected some of the diversity that was in their classrooms. And they produced essays. These essays are online. People can still get them.
Oh, wow.
And the essays then democratized the teaching of maths, science, music, art, English literature, etc., 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 bringing in an African component, bringing in a Native American component, and bringing in an Asian component. And this is, I think, the way to go. And this is what's possible for school children. And then for grown adults, Black Studies does the same thing. If you look at the work of Professor Maulana Karenga, Introduction to Black Studies, he has the history, he has the sociology, the psychology, the politics, the economics, the study of art, the study of literature, the study of music, all from our perspective. And I think that is how radical the African and Caribbean school curriculums should have been had we decolonized.
Well, we clearly haven't decolonized, and when we have to face that. I hope we can post those essays online at some point in time, so that the public can have access to it. I would love to have access to those essays too, because they're very educational in a broad sense, and that's really what we're talking about. To educate, not only the classroom person, but the adults as well, because it has to be across the board. And certainly education, as we know, is a lifelong process, because things are always changing, new discoveries, et cetera, et cetera. So this is very key, but I'm glad you put it in that context, a broader context of not just history per se, but Black studies, if you will, and I don't know, I may want to say African studies overall, because that's really what we're talking about. And I hate to fall into the trap of being defined by somebody else, by the color of skin, as opposed to, as Martin Luther King would say, the content of your mind. But I'm talking about the content of our history, our traditions, and our culture. To me, that's what defines me as an African person. Because we know we have a lot of people with our skin color, but they're not really Africans. They're so brainwashed that they simply, repeat the European mindset and promote not just the ideology, but the way of life in terms of utilizing resources and demonizing others, etc., etc. Again, I don't think I can say enough to sort of emphasize then the work that has to be done. And of course, you can't point your finger and say the work has to be done. Obviously, we have to do the work as well. We're part of what needs to bring about change. I mean,
Can I jump in there, sir? Can I
yes,
jump in?
please do. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Here's the thing. I think what needs to happen
Mm-hmm.
is, first of all, people need to recognize the pioneers.
Mm-hmm.
And the pioneers in this context would be the people are associated with the Portland model baseline essays and build on their stuff. You see, what's happening when it comes to us and dealing with African history, Black studies, whatever you want to call it,
Mm-hmm.
too many of us are focused on one civilization in ancient Africa, Kemet. We're not even producing books on Kemet, but it's all Kemet, 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 Kemet. And nobody is building on what we should be building on. So let's talk about science and technology. Professor Ivan van Sertima wrote Blacks in Science in 1983. And with Blacks in Science in 1983, he laid out, this is what we can do to talk about ancient Africa and its contributions to science and technology, and African Americans and their contribution. That was a good step in the right direction. Then Dr. Charles S. Finch did the book Star of Deep Beginnings, where he's looking at Africans in the origin and evolution of metals, Africans in the origin and evolution of architecture, Africans in the origin and evolution of number and pattern, or mathematics as we would call it, Africans in the origin and evolution of mining, and so on and so forth. So he laid out a template. And then, of course, you've got Hunter Adams and his children's version of it, which became the Portland model. And then what we have to do is get people to build on this. So after Charles Finch, the next important person is Vincent Taraku Farrar, who wrote the book African Pre-Colonial Material Culture, where he's again talking about Africans in the origin and evolution of cotton, in the origin and evolution of iron, in the origin and evolution of a whole bunch of technologies and their technological transfer to the Americas with the capture of enslaved people. And this is the way to go. So that would provide us with the basis of a science curriculum. Then you have a Nigerian scholar, Nnamdi Ele, who wrote the book African Architecture, Evolution and Transformation, which could then become the basis for the teaching of African architecture and showing the different traditions, traditional African architecture, African Christian architecture, African Islamic architecture. So that becomes a way that we can do that, and then we can then attach African American architects to it, and so on and so forth. So there's all kinds of work that's been done, but because so much of the Pan-Africanist conscious community are Kemet, 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 no one is really building on this stuff. And we can do the same thing with literature. We can do the same thing with music. We can do the same thing with mathematics. And ultimately, this is the way to go. So one of my, if you like, concerns has been, since I wrote the book When We Ruled, I've written on Black people in the history of religion, Black people in the history of mathematics, Black people in the history of science and technology, because I want to be a part of people advancing that kind of work and making that work as accessible as possible. And then this now is how we revolutionize the education, because the kind of material that Charles Finch, Vincent Taraku Farrar, Van Sertima, that kind of material should already have formed the basis of what is taught in Black universities in the Caribbean, in Africa, in the historically Black universities. That should already have formed that basis. And what we should be doing generation after generation is building on that. And this is how we transform Black history into Black studies, African studies, whatever term you want to use.
I agree with that. I'll quarrel with you a little bit about everything is Kemet, 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 because in a very real sense, everything is Kemet, Kemet, Kemet. And if you look at on your previous words, everything is Greco-Roman as far as the European presentation of element they're talking about, whether it's sports or it's architecture or it's science or what have you. They go back to a Greek origin, if you will, as if to say the Greeks didn't learn from Kemet. And this is one of the problems that we have, is being able to establish Kemet as the original civilization that everybody else learned from. And of course, there have been people like Diop, and of course, you mentioned Van Sertima, and so many others, Finch, etc., have gone there. And I think that really is key. And you mentioned Karenga, and Karenga is one that really goes back there significantly, especially in terms of culture, and the original ethical sayings of the Husia, as he called it, words of wisdom, and so on, and the whole concept of Ma'at, which is the central, concept of Egyptian life, which is righteousness, justice, truth, and reciprocity, and so on, and which was really the essence of the ideal. I might as well use the word Egyptian, although sometimes I don't want to use it. The ideal Egyptian, or I would rather say the ideal African. And this is one of the things that's lacking in terms of what has happened with Western culture. Western culture doesn't have an ideal human being. Western culture, the people that go on Time magazine cover or Forbes magazine and so on are the Bill Gates and the Warren Buffetts and the head of BlackRock or whoever, and that sort of thing. These are people who have caused enormous damage, and even if they haven't caused enormous damage, how are they exemplars of anything apart from the accumulation of wealth? And that's not the essence of what life is all about. We need to go back to an understanding of Kemet with its spirituality and its understanding of the balance between spirit and matter. And the fact is that we come into existence with a certain potential, just like the oak seed, if you will, has a certain potential. And if you put it in the right soil and if you water it, it will grow. And then with the sunlight, you're definitely going to get an oak tree. It's the same thing with the human being. I mean, the sperm and the ovum, you put them together and you're going to get a human being. If the human being is raised in the right situation, instead of soil, we're talking about family structure. And in terms of sunlight and watering, we're talking about educational process and the culture in which they exist. And you have a flowering of a perfect human being. And back in the day, the flower was the lotus, and Horus was the one who identified with the lotus, and so on and so forth. So it's all there, and has then been manifested in Africa in different national settings, etc. And I would argue that nowadays we're talking a lot about Ubuntu, but Ubuntu is very much the same thing, I think, as Ma'at in terms of it being the essence of the seed that is planted in the human, and that the human now becomes an expression, of that. So I think that we always need to go back to Kemet. Of course, there's Kush and there's Nubia, Nile Valley civilization, because everything sprung from that. Not only within Africa, but also, as you know, outside of Africa, Greece and Rome, as well as in, Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, the Dravidians, and then on into China and Southeast Asia. So we have to reclaim all of that and reclaim it consistently. And so put it in their face, so to speak, because the reverse has been done to us over time. So that we
Can I
are
jump in there, sir?
trying to defend ourselves. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, the reason why I'm making the point I'm making is not to undermine ancient Egypt or the other ancient civilizations, but where Black people have had an influence on the world and we've changed the science and technology of the world, or we've changed the intellectual discourse of the world. It wasn't just ancient Egypt that did that. Yeah. Let me give you an example. In Britain, there's this great figure, Captain James Cook, and Captain Cook is responsible for the discovery of Australia, or that's the way it appears in European books, certainly the ones coming out of Britain. That's the way it's presented. I have here a news article which appeared in a right-wing British newspaper called How 900-Year-Old African Coins Found in Australia May Finally Solve the Mystery of Who Arrived Down Under First. And these coins are from Tanzania. And so you had Tanzanian sailors. I mean, we would call them Tanzanians today. Back in the day, they would have been called the city-state of Kilwa. And these Tanzanians sailed to Australia 900 years ago. So in other words, the point I'm making is if we give all the credit in African culture to ancient Egypt, you wouldn't then you wouldn't get the picture. But wait a minute, they weren't the only people that were making it happen in African world intellectual development. People were making it happen all over Africa. But what it is our scholarship wants to give the credit strictly to ancient Egypt when there were other African civilizations that were contributing to the intellectual history. And that intellectual history, we need to get a full intellectual history in Africa, not just a Kemetic-centric history. And this is why I push Pan-African stuff so much, so that we don't get this idea that it's just one civilization in Africa that's intellectually shaped the world. So just to give you one example, people like to talk about, and they're right, the influence that ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics had on the Phoenicians, and then how the Phoenicians had an influence on the Greeks, and how Greeks had an influence on the Romans. And therefore, we can trace how hieroglyphics became Semitic symbols, became the ancient Greek alphabet, and they became the Roman alphabet. Okay, cool, we can trace that. But that's not the only influence. Did you know that the Ethiopic alphabet is the parent of the Armenian alphabet and the Georgian alphabets of Eastern Europe? No one talks about that. Mm-hmm. And so we then get the impression that the ancient Egyptians were the only clever people in Africa, or the only people in Africa that have influenced our intellectual development. Wasn't just them. There were other Africans doing it too. And we need to give as many of them shine as possible, so that we really can do, just as Europeans can start with Greece and Rome, and then go to the Renaissance, the medieval period, the Renaissance, the 18th century, we can do the same thing and go all over Africa with the same ideas. Do you see?
Yeah, and, definitely. But well, once again, the beginning so far as civilization is concerned, it's certainly, Kemet. I mean, you can speak of Ethiopia, then you have to define Ethiopia in terms of, is it all of Africa? Does Ethiopia
Yeah.
include Egypt, or is Ethiopia then Abyssinia, and so on and so forth? But those are details we don't have to discuss at this particular point. I mean, I know what you're saying, and I think everybody knows what you're saying. There needs to be certainly more inclusion of the other civilization, shall we say. They may be derivative, and some may not be derivative. Some may be original in their own right, in a different geographical setting within the continent. Because certainly we know we have a vast continent that certainly, China, Europe, and America can fit in the continent with a little bit for Japan. So, it's huge. And all of our civilizations didn't necessarily have to start with Nile Valley, or they may have started outside Nile Valley and gotten into Nile Valley, and may not have been connected to Nile Valley at all. But, I think you know this better than I do. But it's important to understand that the studies have to be broad-based in terms of geography and civilization within the continent, and broad-based in terms of not simply looking at history from the perspective of dates and numbers and a straight sort of a timeline, but involving the educational process around our culture and cultural contributions and traditions over time. And you just mentioned something that's extremely important: the whole business of language, and when did writing start? Well, I'm taking you back to Egypt and pyramid texts and so on in terms of 3000 BC, but I think that's also significant to point that out in terms of it being an antecedent by thousands of years in terms of development elsewhere, and being the source of development elsewhere, either because of education, people coming in to educate, or because of migration. And that's significant to understand just the population dynamics of the world, but the intellectual and sociological, I want to say spiritual, and I suppose I should, or as opposed to religious. But if you dig deep at what is behind, and let's say, the Hindu religion, you really go back, shall we say, to Vedanta and the Samkhya philosophy, and you go to Buddhism, and you trace that through India, into Tibet, into China, and into Japan, and you see the influence of African thought, because you and I know that Buddha was one of us. All the early images, shall we say, of Buddha, shows him with curly hair or complexion and features and so on and so forth. Later on, of course, Asians added Asian features, but they kept the curly hair as being symbolic in most of their images. So I'm saying in a long-winded way that history, not just history, but the whole world has been turned on its head, upside down. And that's where we are now, because this whole concept of everything started with Greece and with Rome, and following that in terms of a direct timeline, and everything before that is primitive. And you get these definitions of animism, of paganism, of primitivism,
mhm,
and you know, on and on the derogative statements.
mhm, mhm,
When the history has been rewritten, and not only the history has been rewritten, but then it has been rewritten with such ignorance, because
mhm, mhm,
total lack of understanding, even by so many of the great Egyptologists and so many of these sociologists who have
mhm,
gone to Africa and have supposedly studied, you know, people in the villages or what have you. But they've
mhm,
done all of this from the perspective of ignorance.
mhm,
And I say that because, again, you get back to the European understanding of what is humanly possible. And the only thing they know that's humanly possible is information coming through the five senses, and an intellect then that deals with that information, you know,
mhm,
through logic. And
mhm,
and and that's is the epitome of civilization.
mhm,
That's simply a narrow portion of what reality is. And
mhm,
Africans have always known this, and Africans have always manifested this greater understanding, because there's always been, if you want to call it a sense, you can call it a sixth sense, but there's always been the understanding that we were not different from nature, and we
mhm,
were one with nature. And you go again. It's easier certainly for me to go back to Kemet, and talking about Ausar, and Ausar, you know, being the son of Ra, and
mhm,
this is the identity with God, and also, of course, was the ideal human being from the African perspective. So we are one with our creation. How can you be one with your creation? It's clearly not a physical one. It's a spiritual one. So if you're a
mhm,
spiritual one, then uh, the oneness that you participate in has
mhm,
you know, you have to have access to it, and it has to have access to you. So you
mhm,
get to a unified field, as
mhm,
a universal space. And so
mhm,
this is intrinsic to Africa, you know, for 10,000 years. And it's only coming into an understanding of Europe, you know, within the last few years, if you will, 50 years or
mhm,
so.
mhm,
And it's not been integrated into philosophy. It's not been integrated into religion. It's not been integrated into sociology or ethics. So, you know, this is why everything is chaotic, I think, within the European situation. And I'm
mhm,
saying this to say that Africa and Africans need to have that transformation of mind, of mindset, and to be able to go back to an understanding. And this is why, again, I validate, shall we say, Kemet, because that's where it was first promulgated. And I think
mhm,
that's, you can see it in some sense in its purest form, if you understand the hieroglyphics and the symbolism. You have to
mhm,
understand the symbolism, and you have to understand the fact that much of what was taught allegorically as the best way to transmit information, certainly in terms of something that was of a spiritual nature, and couldn't really be expressed in words, because there's
mhm,
no words for certain things that are beyond the intellect, and really related simply to direct experience. So
mhm,
unless we go back to that, and we have to have an understanding that there's a clear difference and a clear division that was primary.
mhm,
I mean, Europeans like to go back to Plato and talk about the cave and so on and so forth, but Plato didn't have the proper understanding of the Kemetic philosophy. And then
mhm,
they go forward again to people like, you know, Plotinus and what have you, and Hermeticism, as if to say those things are Greek and they did not come, from Africa. But
mhm,
then those things also were demonized within Europe, and
mhm, mhm,
promulgated those ideas. Again, if they were religious, they were burnt at the stake, you know, or they had to retract. And even if they were scientists, as you know, people like Galileo and so on and so forth,
mhm,
you know, because the religion that developed in Europe, certainly 325 or whatever, Council of Nicaea, and then later on Chalcedon and what have you, that said, you know, anyone who does not subscribe to our dogma,
Mhm.
they're, they should be anathemized, if you will. And you know what that means, meaning destroyed. And
Mhm.
that's exactly what they did. They destroyed anybody who did not espouse the dogma and therefore have the faith. And they developed a religion that was based on dogma and faith and externalized with an anthropomorphic conception of God who was separate from the earth and separate from us as human beings, which is
Mhm.
a ridiculous concept. But that is what has made, and you can look the same thing in terms of philosophy.
Mhm.
Philosophy should be about wisdom. Now, what is wisdom?
Mhm.
Wisdom has to be something that you have experienced in terms of actually knowing. And it
Mhm.
certainly has to go back at least to gnosis, Gnosis, which is a direct way of knowing, not an intellectual knowing. Whereas
Mhm.
philosophy that has come down to us in terms of the European sense is about the intellect, and it's about speculation, and it's
Mhm.
about dialectic argumentation, and it
Mhm.
can never discover truth. So you have
Mhm.
a philosophy that can't discover truth. You have a religion that does not you cannot achieve salvation through the religion.
Mhm.
You can only achieve salvation through the dogma, and hopefully some external force will help you,
Mhm.
such as the Pope or the Church, or you know, the confessions, etc., etc. And you're going to get your goodies in the hereafter. I mean,
Mhm.
all of those things separate you from yourself, and they're artificial and they're confusing. And,
Mhm.
and and I think, you know, this is exactly what you see. Europe is confused. I
But my
mean, where's the basis for ethics and values when you're committing genocide? You know, how can genocide be right? I mean, there's no
Can I
conditions
jump
under
in there,
which
sir?
it can be right. Yes, please, because I'm getting carried away with myself a little bit.
Yeah, the main issue here is there has been enough work done by enough scholars to put together the counter curriculum that you're talking about. Um, with the work that has been published on Ma'at, with the work that's been published on African spirituality and so on, there's enough to frame it. But what it is people actually putting pen to paper on one hand and then making it the basis of university curricula on the other hand. That's what will produce the change. And we don't really have an excuse, because if you consider the Portland model stuff was 1989, I seem to remember. That's a long time ago. In other words, we had 40 years to build on that material, 40 years to take that material. And this material is available for free online, you know. So it's a situation where the transformation of what is taught to our next generation, we've had an opportunity. We haven't used that opportunity. We haven't exploited that opportunity. And what I'm calling on is for the Pan-African community, the conscious community, whatever term they want to use, to avail themselves of this information to make the kind of intellectual changes that you're talking about, so that we don't get into this. But what the Europeans teach is wrong. What the Europeans teach is wrong. What the European teach is wrong. No, this is what we're teaching.
Mhm.
And we have to empower ourselves to do this, because, as I've said before, Black history is interesting. Black studies is revolutionary. You see, once you can change the teaching of all the subjects, you now have intellectual revolution.
Mhm. Mhm. You're 100% correct, and think you're in line with my father's thinking.
Mhm.
If I can remember his quote, education is the process by which you bring a people to, I can't think of the quote properly, but to express themselves for their own benefit, something
Yeah,
along those lines. And
yeah.
education, of course, is key. to develop your own civilization.
Yeah.
And if you're poorly educated, then obviously you're not going to, perform appropriately, even within your own civilization. So education is again key. And the point you make is central because, I was at a reparations conference, and I've been at different reparations conferences, and my emphasis has always been that reparations is a two-way situation. We've been damaged as a people over time, not just for 500 years, but for a longer period of time. And we've discussed some of that even just recently. And in order to talk about reparations, we have to repair ourselves as well as repairing the systems that disadvantaged us in terms of enslavement, colonialism, and neocolonialism. So we have to look to change the systems of governance in the world, and we have to get some compensation for free labor and the damage that has been done to us over time. But in that process, we have to repair ourselves. We have to recognize the damage that has been done to us as human beings. Because, whatever system you create, it is going to be run and directed by individual human beings. So, like they say, a chain is as strong as its weakest link. So you can't really have a society with people who are damaged, and I use that in the widest sense when I say damaged, who are mentally enslaved and are still clinging to a system of thought, a system of religion, an economic system, a sociological system that is not simply outdated, but is not, but it's not fully human because it doesn't understand what it means to be a full human being beyond the mind-body complex, which relates to the five senses and the physical body that houses the five senses. And I mean, very, very primitive because that's just being a human animal, you see. And I think the behavior of a human animal is animalistic, and we've seen that, and we're seeing it now in terms of out there, in terms of the genocide in Gaza, and in terms of NATO trying to encroach on Russia, etc., through Ukraine and bring the war to Russia. So, we see that, continuing. And we continuing in the destabilization of Africa because Africa is the richest continent in the world and has 40 to 50% of just about everything that the world needs. Whether it's diamonds or coltan or simply agriculture, and certainly oil and so on and so on and so forth. Unless we're able, as Africans, unless we're able to change the mindset, then we cannot develop our own civilization. And we'll continue to be mimicking, the European, because that's the one who has created our mindset. And if they've created our mindset, then they can manipulate our minds by virtue of the propaganda that they have, which is extensive. In terms of, owning all the media and owning the universities and so on and so forth. And there was just something here recently in the United States where the president of Harvard had to resign because she was, forced to resign because the people who control the money that Harvard, survives on, shall we say. They're the ones that call the shots, and they simply said that she had to resign because her response to something about, genocide in Gaza, was not appropriate. So the power structure. So where's your academic freedom? There's no such thing as academic freedom.
I'm going to jump in there, sir.
Oh yeah, please do.
And this is one of the reasons why academics have to publish outside the system have to become entrepreneurial outside the system, have to be able to survive outside the system, because that's the only way you can genuinely survive and put out real content that you know that the system can't censor. And I think that this is something that a lot of academics need to understand. You have to be able to survive outside the system on your own assets, and your books, your ideas become your assets. You have to work out ways of monetizing them. So consequently, you are not on somebody else's payroll, because if you're on their payroll, they can do to you what they did to that Harvard president.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's true across the board. It's not only true at Harvard per se. And if you look at the media, you find the same thing.
Mhm.
But where do we have now, honest journalism in terms of, back in the day with Woodward and so on, where they outed, Nixon and his den of thieves. You don't have
Mhm.
any journalism like that. Everybody now is towing the line. Everybody's writing the same story. There's
Mhm.
been beaten down, so much that it doesn't matter whether it's the New York Times, the Washington Post, or the Daily News. They're all really saying the same thing.
Mhm.
It's hard, maybe the Guardian there in England is still carrying something, fairly decent.
Can
But
I jump in there, sir? Can I jump in there?
yeah.
And this is where social media has given us an opportunity.
Mhm.
Social media is why me and you can talk from different continents at the same time and present our ideas to a media, to an audience that the system isn't controlling. Do you see? And again, we have to look at these things not as obstacles. We have to look at these things as opportunities, opportunities to make our voices heard, opportunities to get our ideas out there and to produce ideas, publish ideas, so that we can then create an army of scholars, an army of books. So it's
Mhm.
not just my book, When We Ruled. It's not just this book over here, this book over there. There's tons of books
Mhm.
all presenting our history,
Mhm.
tons of books dealing with sociology from our perspective, psychology from our perspective, philosophy from our perspective, what it means to be a human from our perspective. And this is the way that we have to look at it, because an opportunity has presented itself. And I don't think that the Pan-African community is embracing the opportunity for what it is.
You're correct there, and but also in terms of the platforms that we use for social media,
Yeah.
as you know, we don't really control those platforms, and that they are censored as well. But certainly, we do have an opportunity to use them, and we need also to create our own platforms. It's certainly much easier to print our own books,
Yeah.
and clearly that's an advantage which we need to deal more with. But I like your idea that, we have to create a consensus, a group or whatever it is, like-minded people really to push this agenda that we're talking about, which is, education and African studies in the wider sense, you
Mhm.
know, culture, and of course this would include, the whole Pan-African concept in terms of what has happened since the independence of African nations and so on and so forth, the
Mhm.
improvements and the Mandelas and the Mobutus and what have you in terms of the negative ones.
Mhm.
Those things have to be illuminated
Absolutely.
to young people, but because they just keep saying, for example, oh, there are no black leaders. Well, there's a reason, you know, why there are no black leaders that are leading, you know, Africans in the right direction. You know, half of them have been assassinated, or the other half have had coups engineered against them, usually by the CIA or the French. And that continues to this day. So it's not that we don't have African leaders, but they have a target on their back if they stand up for their people. So, you know, only the Quislings survive, so to speak, who are doing the bidding of Macron and these other people. So we have to be serious, as you say. You know, revolution is serious business. And it's revolution not in terms of picking up a gun, but it's revolution in terms of mind change and individual transformation. And therefore, once you have individual transformation, then you have the possibility of change in a large way, moving towards this multipolar society where Africa can come together in terms of being a meaningful participant you know, in the geopolitical arena. And that's where it has to be, because we're 1.5 billion people. And we have to do the intellectual work that will allow us to be cohesive and maximize our intellect as well as our force as a people with all the riches that we have, and the riches are in the ground, on the ground, and certainly within our people, because I believe certainly we're among the most creative people on the planet. And so not among the least creative, we're among the most creative. So the future really should belong to our youngsters, but we have to set the stage better than we've set it so far. And I'd like us to continue on that vein, shall we say, in our next, getting deeper into the whole educational process and how we can structure this thing properly, so that we can get like-minded people really, you know, coming together to move and create, you know, systems that will, you know, allow others to participate and to join, and then to develop that network using social media, using our ability to publish and so on, and therefore, you know, create the information that then would lead to the mind change and the true revolution, which I believe is a mental revolution for our people, so we can have a new African.
Well said, sir.
All right, so I look forward to next time. Thanks very much, Robin.
Thank you.